Hello, friends, and welcome back to Retire and Roam. If you're someone who thinks carefully about how to stretch retirement dollars, make smart lifestyle choices, discover overlooked places, or learn the hidden history behind towns most people pass by, you're in exactly the right place. Have you ever felt the urge to step away from the noise for a while? To leave behind the constant alerts, the crowded highways, the rising costs, and the pressure of modern life? The Appalachian Mountains, running for more than 2,000 miles from the American South into Canada, have long been a refuge for people seeking distance, privacy, and a different way of living. For generations, these misty ridges, narrow hollows, and forgotten valleys have sheltered communities with stories the outside world nearly erased. Today, we're heading deep into that world as we explore the 12 most remote towns in the Appalachian Mountains. Some were shaped by idealistic dreams, some by harsh industry, and some now stand as fading ghost towns being slowly reclaimed by the land. Yet every one of them reveals something powerful about resilience, survival, and the true cost of isolation. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, settle in, and join me for this journey. And if you enjoy exploring America's hidden places and retirement-minded discoveries, be sure to subscribe to Retire and Roam before we begin. 1. Greenbank, West Virginia, the sound of silence. Our first stop is remote in a way that feels almost impossible today. Not because of steep roads or economic decline, but because the law demands it. Tucked deep in a valley within the Allegheny Mountains, Greenbank, West Virginia is one of the quietest places in America in a very literal sense. Pull out your phone here, and it won't help you much. No signal, no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth. In some cases, even everyday household devices are restricted. The reason is extraordinary. Greenbank sits at the heart of the National Radio Quiet Zone, a 13,000 square mile area created in 1958 to protect the Greenbank Telescope, the largest fully steerable radio telescope in the world. That telescope is listening for the faintest signals from deep space, picking up whispers from galaxies so distant their light began traveling long before human life ever appeared. Even a small burst of interference from modern electronics can disrupt that work. What makes Greenbank so compelling, especially for those of us thinking seriously about lifestyle, priorities, and peace of mind, is that this silence is not an accident. It is protected. Some people actually choose to move here because they are tired of living under constant digital pressure. And that raises a question worth carrying with us into the rest of this journey. In our effort to stay connected to everything, what have we slowly disconnected from? Sometimes the clearest thinking begins when the noise finally stops. 2. Lost Cove, North Carolina, the ghost town the mountains reclaimed. If Greenbank shows us silence by design, Lost Cove reveals what happens when isolation runs so deep that a community can no longer hold itself together. High above the Nolichucky River on Flat Top Mountain, Lost Cove was once one of the most cut-off settlements in the region. Founded in 1864 by a Union soldier said to have traded a shotgun and $10 for the land, it became the very definition of off-grid mountain living. For decades, there were no paved roads, no electricity, and no running water. Families survived through grit and skill, growing what they could, hunting what they needed, and building a life with their own hands. Because it sat near a disputed stretch between North Carolina and Tennessee, it also became a natural hiding place for moonshiners. Tax agents had a hard enough time finding it, let alone controlling it. But even the toughest communities have limits. As timber resources declined and rail service faded, the same remoteness that once protected Lost Cove began to work against it. In the winter of 1957, the last family left, carrying what they could and expecting to come back. They never did. Today, those who make the long hike in will find weathered headstones, broken foundations, and rusted tools resting under the moss. Lost Cove reminds us that self-reliance is powerful, but it is not the whole story. At some point, every person and every town needs connection. And in the mountains, when people leave, nature does not hurry. It simply takes everything back. 3. Helvetia, West Virginia, the Swiss time capsule. From a ghost town reclaimed by the forest, we come to a place that refused to disappear at all. Helvetia, West Virginia feels like a small miracle hidden in the Appalachian backcountry. Imagine making your way through rugged mountain wilderness in the late 19th century and suddenly finding a village that looks and feels like a corner of the Swiss Alps. That is the story of Helvetia. Founded in 1869 by Swiss and German immigrants, including craftsmen such as watchmakers, cheesemakers, and stonemasons, the town was built by people determined to create a life shaped by freedom, skill, and tradition. They named it Helvetia, the Latin word for Switzerland. Today, only a few dozen residents remain, but the town still holds tightly to its identity. Each winter, Helvetia comes alive during Fastnacht, a pre-Lenten celebration that feels both ancient and unforgettable. Residents wear handcrafted masks, carry lanterns through the snowy dark, and burn an effigy of Old Man Winter in a bonfire that welcomes the coming spring. Even now, visitors can sit down for a meal at the Huda restaurant and feel that the old world has not entirely vanished from these hills. What makes Helvetia so meaningful is the lesson beneath its beauty. Heritage does not survive on its own. It survives because people decide it matters enough to protect, practice, and pass on. And for many of us thinking about retirement, legacy, and the kind of life we want to build, that may be one of the most valuable lessons in all of Appalachia. Traditions stay alive when someone cares enough to keep the fire burning. 4. Thurmond, West Virginia, the boomtown's last breath. If Helvetia shows us a town preserving its soul, Thurmond shows us what happens when a town loses the very engine that made it matter. There was a time when Thurmond, West Virginia was one of the most active and profitable places in the region. In 1910, this small town handled more freight than Cincinnati, and its banks ranked among the richest in the state. Hidden deep in the New River Gorge, Thurmond was unusual for another reason, too. For many years, there were no roads leading in. If you wanted to reach it, you came by train. That meant the railroad was not just part of town life, it was town life. The tracks served as the main street, and the pulse of the place rose and fell with the arrival of locomotives. Across the river stood the notorious Dun Glen Hotel, where money, isolation, and appetite for risk created stories that still linger, including the famous tale of a poker game said to have lasted 14 straight years. But boomtowns built on one industry rarely stay secure forever. Once railroads shifted from steam to diesel, trains no longer needed to stop for coal and water, and Thurmond's reason for thriving began to disappear. Today, Thurmond stands as a ghost town under National Park Service care, with only a handful of residents left. It is one of the clearest Appalachian reminders that prosperity can vanish faster than people expect. Industries rise, fortunes grow, and then the world changes. What remains are the stories, the lessons, and the question Thurmond leaves behind for all of us. Are we building our lives on what is temporary, or on what truly endures? 5. Burke's Garden, Virginia, God's thumbprint. From the rise and fall of a railroad town, we move to a place that seems protected by geography itself. Burke's Garden, tucked away in Tazewell County, Virginia, is one of the most remarkable natural enclaves in Appalachia. Locals have long called it God's thumbprint, and once you understand the landscape, it's easy to see why. Burke's Garden is a vast, bowl-shaped valley ringed almost completely by a mountain rising to around 4,700 feet. It feels less like an ordinary valley and more like a world set apart. It is also Virginia's highest valley and one of its most fertile. Yet only about 300 people live there, many of them Amish families who still work the land in ways that feel rooted in another era, using horse-drawn plows and time-tested rhythms of farming. In the late 19th century, the Vanderbilt family saw the valley's beauty and wanted to buy the entire place for a grand estate. But the local farmers would not sell. They held their ground, and after being turned away, the Vanderbilts went on to build Biltmore in North Carolina instead. That decision changed the future of Burke's Garden. Because the people living there chose not to cash out, the valley remained peaceful, rural, and largely untouched by the kind of commercial development that transforms so many beautiful places. Burke's Garden offers a lesson that feels especially meaningful in a world where nearly everything seems negotiable. Some things are worth more than money. Sometimes the quiet life, the family land, and the peace you protect are richer than any fortune ever offered. 6. Rugby, Tennessee, the broken utopian dream. If Burke's Garden represents a community defending what it already had, Rugby tells the story of outsiders trying to build something entirely new. In 1880, British author Thomas Hughes arrived in the mountains of East Tennessee with an ambitious and idealistic plan. He wanted to create a utopian settlement for the younger sons of the English gentry, men with education and refinement, but without inheritance or title. He named the colony Rugby, and for a short while, it looked like his dream might actually take root. The settlement quickly developed the marks of a cultured community. There was Victorian architecture, a literary society, a newspaper, and even a tennis team. At its height, around 300 residents were trying to shape a class-free Christian colony in the Appalachian Hills. On paper, it sounded noble and visionary. In practice, the land had other plans. The mountain soil was thin and difficult. The work was physically demanding, and many of the settlers were not prepared for the realities of frontier life. Then came typhoid in 1881, dealing a devastating blow to an already fragile experiment. Within 7 years, the dream had collapsed. Rugby remains one of the most fascinating reminders that good intentions alone are never enough. Vision matters, but vision without practicality can unravel quickly when tested by real conditions. In that sense, Rugby speaks far beyond its own history. Whether in retirement, business, or daily life, our biggest dreams still have to meet the ground beneath our feet. Nature does not adjust itself to match our ideals. We have to learn how to work with reality if we want anything lasting to survive. 7. Elkmont, Tennessee. The resort the mountains reclaimed from a failed idealistic colony, we now arrive at a place that once offered escape, elegance, and summer comfort in the mountains. Deep inside what is now Great Smoky Mountains National Park lies Elkmont, Tennessee. In the early years, it began as a logging camp, rough and practical, built around timber and hard labor. But before long, Elkmont transformed into something very different. Wealthy families from the cities discovered its cool mountain air and turned it into an upscale summer retreat, filling the area with cottages, lodges, laughter, and seasonal traditions. For a time, Elkmont represented the dream of mountain leisure, a place where people could step away from heat and noise and enjoy beauty on their own terms. But in the 1930s, that story changed when the federal government created the national park. Property owners were given a difficult choice: sell and leave right away, or sell at a reduced price in exchange for a lifetime lease. Most chose the lease, and for decades, families continued returning to the cottages they loved. But time does not pause for sentiment. Those leases eventually expired in 1992, and the last private residents had to let go. Afterward, the cabins stood empty for years, slowly overtaken by ferns, vines, and rhododendrons, giving Elkmont the haunting look of a beautiful place suspended between memory and disappearance. What makes Elkmont so moving is not just its abandonment, but the question it leaves us with. How do we release something we love when our season with it has ended? Elkmont reminds us that preservation and progress often pull in different directions, and that in the end, we do not truly own the land. We only care for it for a little while.
The lesson doesn't end here, because further down these mountains, another town tells the same truth in a very different way.
8. Cass, West Virginia, turning memory into survival. If Elkmont shows us a place the mountains slowly took back, Cass shows us what can happen when a town refuses to fade away. Founded in 1901, Cass was a true company town, owned outright by the West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company. This was no small operation. Men worked punishing 11-hour days, 6 days a week, cutting spruce and hemlock from the high mountain slopes and sending that timber down by rail. It was hard, dangerous work, and like so many resource towns in Appalachia, it depended on one thing lasting forever that never does. By 1960, the mill shut down because the timber was gone. In most places, that would have been the end of the story. The jobs disappear, the houses empty out, and the forest begins its slow return. But Cass found another path. The state bought the old logging railroad and turned it into a scenic tourist line. Now, instead of hauling timber, those same steam locomotives carry visitors up the same steep grades, offering them a living connection to the town's past. Even the old company houses have taken on new life as vacation rentals. That is what makes Cass so memorable. It did not deny its history, and it did not let that history bury it either. It repurposed what it had. And for anyone thinking about retirement, reinvention, or the next stage of life, Cass offers a lesson worth holding on to. When one purpose ends, another can begin. Sometimes the best future starts by finding new value in what we thought had been left behind. 9. Nuttallburg, West Virginia, the vertical coal frontier. From a town that reinvented itself, we come to one that still stands as a raw monument to labor, hardship, and sacrifice. Hidden in the steep terrain of the New River Gorge, Nuttallburg was once one of the region's booming coal towns. Beginning in the 1870s, it produced high-grade smokeless coal, so valuable that Henry Ford bought the mine in the 1920s to help power his automobile factories in Michigan. On paper, that sounds like success. On the ground, life here was brutally hard. Everything about Nuttallburg was shaped by the demands of the company. Miners were often paid in scrip, a form of company money that could only be used at the store the company controlled. Families lived in housing perched along steep hillsides, always tied to the fortunes of the mine. And if a miner was killed, his widow and children could be pushed out with frightening speed. There was very little security, very little mercy, and no real escape from the system that governed daily life. By the 1950s, the town was abandoned. Today, if you make the trip to Nuttallburg, you can still see the remains of its industrial machinery, including the long, rusting coal conveyor that cuts down the mountain. It is one of the starkest reminders in Appalachia that America's modern growth was built not only by vision and industry, but by the physical toll carried by working families. Places like Nuttallburg ask us to look beyond convenience and comfort and remember the people whose labor made both possible. 10. Fontana Dam and the Road to Nowhere, North Carolina. If Nuttallburg tells the story of labor and loss above ground, Fontana tells the story of whole communities erased beneath the water. During World War II, the federal government needed massive amounts of electricity to support the war effort, and that urgency led to the construction of the 480-foot Fontana Dam in western North Carolina. It was an engineering achievement by any measure, but like many large projects, its benefits came at a deeply personal cost. To create the reservoir behind the dam, entire mountain communities were flooded, and more than 1,300 families were forced from homes tied to generations of memory. Places like Proctor and Bone Valley did not simply move. They disappeared. In exchange, the government promised to build a road so displaced families could still reach the cemeteries where their relatives were buried. A few miles were built, a tunnel was blasted through the rock, and then the work stopped. Environmental concerns, budget problems, and delays left the project unfinished. That abandoned stretch became known with bitter accuracy as the Road to Nowhere. Few places in Appalachia capture the emotional cost of progress more clearly than this one. Beneath Fontana Lake lie roads, homes, and family histories that cannot be recovered. The unfinished road stands as a reminder that when governments and institutions make promises during times of upheaval, those promises matter long after the headlines fade. Fontana asks us to think about who pays the price when history moves forward, and how some losses remain quiet, unresolved, and deeply human. 11. Little Switzerland, North Carolina, the curated escape. After so many stories of hardship, abandonment, and broken promises, Little Switzerland offers a very different kind of isolation. Here, remoteness was not forced by collapse or geography alone. It was shaped into something intentional. Perched at about 3,500 feet along the Blue Ridge Parkway, Little Switzerland was founded in 1910 as a mountain resort community inspired by the charm and beauty of the Swiss Alps. From the beginning, it was meant to feel like an escape. And in many ways, it still does. This is a place where isolation has been almost carefully designed. In winter, when snow and ice move into the high country, sections of the parkway often close, cutting the town off in a way that would frustrate many people elsewhere. But for the residents who live here, that seasonal separation is part of the appeal. They embrace the stillness, the slower pace, and the self-sufficient rhythm that mountain life demands when the outside world becomes temporarily distant. What makes Little Switzerland so appealing is the reminder that solitude is not always something to fear. Sometimes it can be chosen, shaped, and protected. For people thinking about retirement or a simpler next chapter, that idea carries real weight. A peaceful life does not happen by accident. It is often something we build on purpose. And in a noisy world, the chance to create a private sanctuary of beauty and calm may be one of the greatest luxuries of all. 12. Highlands, North Carolina, the Cloudland Refuge. Our final stop takes us to one of the most breathtaking refuges in the entire Appalachian Range. Highlands, North Carolina sits on a high plateau more than 4,100 feet above sea level. And while developers in the late 19th century once imagined it becoming a major commercial center, that future never arrived. Instead, Highlands evolved into something far rarer and in many ways far more valuable: a secluded mountain sanctuary. Surrounded by national forest and reached only by steep, winding mountain roads, Highlands feels set apart from the modern rush below. Its elevation and heavy rainfall, more than 80 inches each year, have created a unique climate unlike much of the surrounding region. The result is a lush, temperate rainforest landscape filled with rare mosses, cool air, and powerful waterfalls that seem to tumble out of every fold in the mountains. And although the town now includes elegant inns and upscale comforts, it still feels like a true mountain island, removed from the heat, noise, and pace of the lowlands. That is what makes Highlands such a fitting final destination for this journey. It is not just beautiful, it is preserved, elevated, and quietly set apart. And maybe that is the lesson it leaves with us. Sometimes, to find the clearest air and the clearest perspective, we have to be willing to climb higher, take the long road, and step away from the places everyone else is rushing toward. From the intentional silence of Greenbank to the old-world traditions of Helvetia, from the rusted industrial remains of Nuttallburg to the submerged memories beneath Fontana Lake, the Appalachian Mountains hold stories shaped by endurance, sacrifice, reinvention, and quiet strength. Each of these remote towns reveals something more than distance on a map. Together, they show us how communities respond when they are cut off, overlooked, or left behind by the modern world. And that may be the deeper truth behind this entire journey. Isolation is never only about geography. It is about what people choose to protect when everything else changes. It is about the traditions families refuse to let die, the memories communities carry forward, and the peaceful spaces people create when the outside world becomes too loud, too fast, or too demanding. So as you move through your week, maybe take a moment to ask yourself something simple. Are you moving too fast to hear what matters? Do you need your own quiet hollow, your own mountain refuge, your own place to slow down and listen again? Thank you for spending this time with me here on Retire and Roam. If this journey meant something to you, please subscribe, give the video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever visited a ghost town, a hidden valley, or a place so remote it changed the way you saw life? Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and always remember to retire and roam.